Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's inaugural new book showcase for WFRN's virtual conference series. I'm so excited about this panel. I am the co-vice president. I'm Katie Collins along with Leah Ruppanner, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today virtually on behalf of WFRN's leadership team. Our fearless president, Jennifer Hook, is on the call, as is our executive director, Steve Sweet. So y'all know I love a good title if you know me. I called today's event Labor and Inequality in Contemporary Family Life, Perils and Possibilities. And we'll be learning about three fantastic new books by Allison, Daminger, Jaclyn, Wong, and Bailey Brown. A couple brief points before we dive in. If you are joining here today, this means you're consenting to having us record this chat, and it will be posted on WFRN's YouTube channel. So please feel free to share the video widely after it's posted. And secondly, a big point to mention to all of you is our conference in just a few months, June 17th to 20th at Concordia University in Montreal. We got a huge number of fantastic submissions, and it promises to be a great conference. I will also mention that early registration, which means reduced fees, ends, let's see, February 1st. So please sign up now if you're planning on attending. And those are all my announcements. Let's get the ball rolling today, y'all. We conceived of this event, Leah and I, because it's really tough to keep up with all of the incredible scholarship in this field. I feel like work family scholars are unusually prolific, perhaps. So to me, hearing directly from authors in this more conversational format is both a really fun, but also perhaps an efficient way to go about learning about their work. And I think that these three books speak beautifully to one another. And getting to bring these three authors together virtually in one room is a real joy for me as someone who really deeply admires their scholarship. So I plan to introduce each panelist in turn today and give them the floor for 10 to 15 minutes. And I asked them to put together kind of a more conversational talk about the big takeaways on their books. Yeah, y'all know that we can get into the weeds on the methods and the theory and all of that stuff in Q&A if we want to, but I requested that they give us kind of the narrative, the story of their book. So that's the game plan. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A of all three books at the end after they've presented. Please do feel free to drop questions into the chat as they go if you want to, or you can save them for the end. So we'll visit the chat at the end altogether to bring those up. And let me first introduce you to Allison Daminger, who's going to be our first presenter today. Dr. Daminger is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I think wins the award for being in the coldest place on the screen, at least that I've heard of so far, with a real feel of -40. So Allison, I wish I could give you a prize of some sort for enduring the cold. Thank you for being here. Dr. Daminger's award-winning work on mental labor and marital power dynamics has been published in our field's top journals like ASR and Gender and Society. She's interviewed regularly in some of our country's most prominent media outlets, and she even has her own weekly newsletter called the Daminger Dispatch, which I encourage you to subscribe to. She's going to be discussing her new book called What's on Her Mind, The Mental Workload of Family Life, published by Princeton University Press last fall. Welcome, Dr. Daminger.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's so delightful to see so many familiar faces and names in the Zoom. And also, I'm grateful to be inside on a day like today. So let me get my slide sharing going. Right. All good? Awesome. All right, so it is challenging, to say the least, to try to condense an entire book that took me nearly a decade to write into just 15 minutes. So as Katie said, this is kind of a teaser, right? The goal is to introduce you to some of the book's core ideas, hopefully pique your interest in learning more in the Q&A or beyond. So first, I want you to meet Heather and Jeremy. They're one of the couples that I interviewed for this project, and I'm going to use their story to illustrate some of the core themes from my findings with different gender couples. I also have a chapter on queer couples, but today we're going to focus on the different gender couples. Now, when I interviewed Heather and Jeremy, Heather was nearing the end of a pretty long parental leave from her research position. She just had a baby, and she also had a preschooler at home. Meanwhile, Jeremy was working full-time as the manager of a large research lab on a nearby university's campus. And when I asked them about their home life, Heather was extremely enthusiastic about Jeremy's participation. She said the second he gets home, he can barely get his jacket or shoes or bag off his body before he's diving in. I mean, he's really all in, like all the time. When I talked to Jeremy later that day, he told a similar story, but he admitted that his involvement only extended so far. He said the expression we have is that Heather sets it up and I knock it down. She makes the list and then I execute the list. Now, Heather and Jeremy are a kind of prototypical case of what I call in the book woman-led couples. These are different gender couples who seem pretty egalitarian on the surface, in large part because the man is heavily involved in the physical work of running their household. But that apparent balance often hides pretty marked inequalities in another kind of household work, which I call cognitive labor. This kind of inequality between partners like Heather and Jeremy has often gone overlooked because a lot of the foundational work on gender inequality in households relies really heavily on the clock, right? That is, researchers who want to understand who is doing what for a household, how much they're contributing, usually look at who is spending more time on action-based chores like cooking, cleaning, shopping, mowing the lawn, right? The things that probably come to mind when you think about housework. And this time-based research is wonderful, right? It has given us so much valuable information about gender gaps in family life, right? It consistently shows, has for decades, that women are spending more time on housework and childcare than men are. That gender gaps have remained, more or less stable for the last several decades, and that this inequality between men and women is not fully explained by economic factors, like who is earning more or working longer hours. Again, that's all extremely important. But what I'm trying to do is to broaden our understanding and to say that if we just look at these metrics, we're going to have an incomplete picture of how gender shapes men's and women's experiences in families, right? Time-based measures are very good at capturing the doing work, but they're not so good at capturing the thinking work. So I'm building on a long tradition of feminist scholarship that challenges dominant understandings of what labor is and draws attention to forms of work that really resist quantification. And so in What's on Her Mind, one of my goals was to introduce a framework for really carefully operationalizing and systematically measuring a particular kind of what is sometimes called invisible or hidden labor. Now, this work I call cognitive labor. It's got 4 components. First, someone needs to anticipate some sort of need. Next, they've got to identify options for meeting the need, right? Whether that is through a simple brainstorm or a more formal research process that involves, going online, producing a spreadsheet, talking to friends. Next, they have to make a decision, choosing what they think is going to be the best path forward among the options they assembled. And finally, they have to monitor or follow up to say, hey, did what I decided on, A, get done, and B, did it actually meet the need or solve the problem? Or do I need to go back to, an earlier phase in the process and come up with a new possibility? So that's pretty abstract. Let me give you an example. Although it is January, I imagine many of you in the audience with school-age children are probably already thinking about summer camp, depending on when these registrations tend to come up in your area. Right, so this is one of many kind of core cognitive tasks that parents end up partaking in. So first you have to anticipate, right? Summer is coming, even though it feels very far away in this moment. And, if you are employed or if you want your kid to have some sort of enrichment, right, you're going to have to figure out what to do with them over the summer. So then you go to the research stage. You are looking at Google reviews, you are talking with friends, maybe you're on some parenting forums online, right? And you are sort of compiling a set of possible camps that would fit in terms of your budget and timeline and, distance from your home, etc. Then eventually you get to the decision-making stage where you say, okay, I think that child A is going to go to the YMCA camp for 8 weeks. Child B, we're going to do, half the summer will be at this STEM camp and half the summer will be at this soccer camp. And then you have to monitor, right? Let's say you have delegated the actual registration to your spouse. You might follow up rather and say, hey, were you able to get in, right? Did we get a spot? Maybe you had some questions, right? Maybe your child has some allergies, and so you've been in contact with the camp director to hear if they can accommodate it. Did you hear back from the director? Right? And depending on what you learn in this monitoring stage, you might need to go back to the research and come up with a new plan. Now, my instructions from Leah and Katie were to focus on big ideas and leave out the discussion about data and methods. But I can't help but briefly just mention my data here, since I know I've got a lot of academics in the room. These insights that I'm sharing today come from 172 interviews conducted with the members of 94 different gender and queer couples, all of whom were parenting children under 18. Now, this is a big sample by qualitative standards, but it is by no means representative, right? One of the limitations is definitely that it skews very racially and socioeconomically privileged. And so one reason I'm excited to be in conversation with Bailey today in particular is that I think she's going to help us think about how race and class and gender operate together. All right, back to what I found. 4 out of 5 of the different gender couples I interviewed looked a lot like Heather and Jeremy. She was acting as sort of the cognitive laborer in chief. The remaining 1 in 5 were roughly split between man-led couples, where he was doing most of the cognitive labor, and balanced couples, where it was close to 50-50. I couldn't really distinguish with any confidence who was the leader. Now, when we break it down by anticipating, researching, deciding, and monitoring, we start to see some different patterns, right? Women-led couples often preferred to make decisions together. Right? I have another paper with Jaclyn that draws on these data that talks about this ideal of mutuality, right? And that came through very strongly in my data, that these couples wanted to think of themselves not as acting unilaterally, but as deciding together. But in many cases, that emphasis on mutuality obscured the fact that the setup and follow-up work that got them to and through that decision stage was largely completed by the woman partner. She was the one with her metaphorical antenna up, always anticipating what was coming. She was also the one primarily monitoring things on the back end to make sure that whatever the initial need or problem was had been satisfactorily resolved. Now, many of the couples that I interviewed recognized this as a form of inequality in their relationship, and many of them also saw it as suboptimal in some way. But when I asked them why they thought they divided up cognitive labor in this fashion, what I heard over and over again was, it's not a gender thing, it's a me thing. Right? That's a quote from one of my respondents. That is, they told me that it came down to individual personality differences. And what I saw was 2 archetypes, right? The woman partner was usually depicted as what I call a superhuman. Right? She's type A, she's naturally organized, she's better at managing details and planning ahead, maybe a bit neurotic. The man partner was usually described as what I call a bumbler, right? He's laid back, he goes with the flow, he's better at being present, right? Maybe a bit disorganized. Now back to Heather and Jeremy, right? Again, they're kind of a classic case of this dynamic. Here's how they described these different personalities. Jeremy said, Heather's a planner and is just constantly thinking about this stuff. I wouldn't say I'm a doer necessarily. I'm also a thinker, but I'm just more disorganized. When I talked to Heather, she said something similar from her perspective. The platonic ideal of a marriage, where the division of labor is completely equal, just doesn't lend itself to our personalities. I'm so much more uptight than Jeremy is. Now, this personality explanation makes a lot of sense at face value. But when I looked at the aggregate data, I wasn't convinced that that was the best explanation for the patterns that I observed. And so what I ended up arguing is that what couples saw as fixed aspects of their individual personalities were more often a function of learned skills. And I talk about 2 different processes that were at work here. Number one, I saw that women were investing earlier and more intensively in building up the really domain-specific capacities that made them good at family cognitive labor, especially parenting cognitive labor. That meant they read up on parenting best practices. They were forming more relationships with their kids' teacher and pediatrician. They were more likely to join online parenting forums. They were more likely to talk to other moms at pickup. And over time, this meant that they were both more knowledgeable and better connected, which enabled them to carry out a lot of this work more effectively. Number two, men and women also deployed their more general skills, right? Things that overlap a lot with what psychologists call executive function, working memory, problem solving, flexibility, etc. They deployed them differently across home and paid work. So one example, if you remember Jeremy, right, our classic case of bumbler, he talked a lot about how, he just wasn't good at this sort of thing. He left it to Heather. But Jeremy was a professional manager running a large campus research lab. So since I'm running near the end of my time, I'll close out with a few takeaways. So I argue in the book that cognitive labor acts as a kind of invisible engine powering family life. Very little would get done without it. But when individuals and couples and scholars historically think about the kinds of contributions people are making to their household, it often gets left out, right? And that has a lot of implications for our understanding of how gender operates, for how gratitude and appreciation flow within households, etc. Now, when we add cognitive labor to the picture, it becomes easier to see just how different men's and women's experiences of family life still are, despite a lot of changes to the gender structure. Right, I talked a minute ago about, these different investment and deployment patterns, and I don't ascribe them, primarily to individual intention, right? I think a lot of it is about what are the structures of accountability that still hold men and women responsible for different things in domestic life. Now, to end on a hopefully slightly more positive note, I do think that this finding about it being a narrative of personality, right, actually suggests room for change. Because I think if we can help people and help ourselves to think about the way that we are currently dividing this work as not necessarily a function of our intrinsic natures, but a function of, how we've invested our skills, what we've worked on building up, what we've let atrophy, then I think that might actually stand a chance at moving the needle for those couples for whom this kind of allocation does not match their underlying values. So I'm going to close out there and hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A. You can get the book wherever it's sold, but I've got a discount code on this slide that'll give you 30% off at the publisher. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison. This is an example of a stellar head style talk, in my opinion. Thank you for these fabulous
Great.
slides. I was taking
Never
notes
given a TED
also.
Talk, so I don't know.
Taking notes to myself on presentation of data, which I find really a difficult task as a qualitative scholar. So thank you for that, Allison. I've used your term cognitive labor countless times, both in my own household and also in conversation with friends and colleagues. So thank you for your work. I would now like to introduce Jaclyn Wong. Jaclyn is a research analyst at Langer Research, and before joining Langer, she was an associate professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Wong studies gender, work, marriage, and family, as well as aging and health. And her research has also been published in top journals and covered in lots of our major news outlets. And today she's going to be presenting her book, Equal Partners, How Dual Professional Couples Make Career, Relationship, and Family Decisions, published with University of California Press. And of course, I want to point out that this book received ASA Sex and Gender Section's Distinguished Book Award honorable mention. Welcome, Dr. Wong.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to see everyone here and to be in conversation with Dr. Brown and Dr. Daminger's books. It's such a fantastic panel. Thanks for organizing. Let me get my slides up, and I'm going to jump right in because we only have so much time. All right. So, Equal Partners uses 4 waves of interview data to tell the story of how 21 dual professional couples launched their careers, navigated their relationships, and started families over a 6-year period. To give a very brief summary, the couples in my study followed 3 work-family pathways distinguished by unique combinations of the structural conditions of the partners' workplaces, each person's cultural attitudes towards gender, work, and family, and the partners' joint actions, which are kind of the invisible labor that I'd really like to highlight here, that coordination work between partners. So the consistent compromisers traveled on an egalitarian work-family pathway over time. These partners had consistent access to supportive workplace conditions. They held fast to their egalitarian beliefs, and they regularly coordinated their actions to share resources and navigate constraints together. The consistent compromiser men, in particular, stood out for using their workplace advantages to support women's careers and enable their own participation in domestic activities. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the tending traditional couples who fell into a gender unequal work family arrangement early on, and they got stuck there over time. These partners faced relatively greater work-related challenges. They were more open to temporarily having a gendered division of labor that they hoped that they could reverse in the future. And they took gender complementary actions to meet their current work and family responsibilities. When tending traditional men faced prolonged unemployment, which violated masculinity norms, dictating that men should work, partners mobilized together to get men a job, no matter the cost to women's careers. This division of labor got very hard to change over time because men became specialized in paid work and women became specialized in caregiving. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go into more detail about the perils and possibilities related to invisible family labor on the autonomous actor pathway. Like the consistent compromisers, autonomous actors had good access to workplace supports to facilitate gender equality in work and family. However, they differed in their attitudes about what counted as gender egalitarianism. First, they expressed support for men's and women's equal right to pursue their best individual opportunities. Second, they believed that men and women were equally responsible for preserving their partner's autonomy by refraining from holding each other back in their pursuits. So, this seemingly gender neutral logic was actually paired with a gendered pattern of action in which men passively stated their support for whatever women wanted to do, but many women were more active about compromising their careers for the couple. So I'll show you exactly what that looked like with a couple, Max and Julie. Max and Julie started dating in college, and they both wanted to be doctors in the future. They ended up going to separate medical schools in different cities, and they maintained a long distance relationship the entire time. They hoped that their next step of training, medical residency, would finally put them together in the same city. Once they were in the same place, they said that they wanted to make more serious plans about living together, getting married, and perhaps eventually having children. When I interviewed Max at time one, he was several months into the first year of his residency at a hospital in a pretty remote region of the United States. When I asked him how he came to choose this program, knowing that Julie had to apply for residency programs too, he said, out of all the places I interviewed, I like this hospital the best. Knowingly, it wasn't ideal for our relationship. It would have probably been better to go to places where there would be more programs for Julie to apply to. So it was maybe not the best decision at that point, but it was the place I liked the best. Max explained that although he and Julie did discuss locations that could work well for both of them and their medical specialties, he ultimately chose the best option for his own career, and he fully expected Julie to do the same. Julie, however, told me that she emphasized being in the same place as Max when choosing residencies for herself. She said, "This Mountain West hospital is at the absolute top of places that I wanted to apply to because Max had already matched there the year before. I kind of decided based on the fact that he was there and that we were trying to be in the same place." Julie, however, emphasized to me that she was making an independent choice when she was restricting her applications. But it was Max's decision to train at this specific hospital that led Julie to prioritize her application here at time one. Julie was making interdependent plans while Max was making independent ones. These gendered actions lined up with the autonomous actors' gender neutral logics because Max and Julie were free to make their independent choices, and neither of them would stop each other from whatever pursuit they decided on they decided to go with. However, Max and Julie enacted their beliefs differently, such that Julie compromised her career more than Max did. The partners could dismiss this inequality in the level of effort they put into coordinating their two careers because they could point to this gender neutral logic that was driving their actions. At time two, regardless of whether the partners secured job offers, autonomous actors always left it up to women to make whatever decisions they felt would be best. For example, Max said, I mean, we didn't make any specific contingency plans if Julie didn't match to his hospital, other than we would figure it out. We would make it work in some way or another. Max was doing whatever he was doing in his residency all along and didn't have any specific ideas or plans for what to do if Julie did not end up getting matched to his hospital, because he wanted to let Julie decide what was best for her ultimately. Autonomous actor women reacted to this kind of hands-off stance in various ways, depending on women's access to any kind of external resources to facilitate two careers and a relationship in the same place. Julie happened to have a high level of access to professional resources to support a dual career relationship, and so she took advantage of them. Between time one and time two, she found out about and decided to make use of a formal program that could increase her chances of matching to Max's hospital. She told me, I went to Max's hospital to do an away rotation there. If you really need to end up in an area, it's sometimes a good idea to do a rotation there so that the program knows who you are. If you go and work really hard and they like you, it can be a boost up. In my specialty, away rotations are not required unless you have a really good reason for why you want to end up at a certain place. So, because I had a good reason why I wanted to end up there, I ended up going out there. Julie did this extra work to increase her chances of reuniting the couple while still advancing the partner's two careers. And we can see that Max did not put an equal amount of work to support this dual career couple. At time three, Julie matched to Max's hospital. So she moved in with him and they both started working as medical residents. Or, I mean, Max was already working as a medical resident, but Julie also started working as a resident. For this couple, attitudes around autonomy came together with the workplace supports that Julie independently leveraged to produce roughly gender equal outcomes in careers that also helped the partners end that long distance stint. In Max and Julie's story, we can see that a gender equal outcome can result from gender unequal processes that mask a gender unequal power dynamic in which women work harder than men do to get an outcome that both people want. This power imbalance in which men's careers in the couple benefited from women's invisible work was not set in stone, however. So here are some possibilities about gender equality in invisible family labor. Over time, what I saw with the autonomous actors, including Max and Julie, was that these partners made career, relationship, and family decisions more interdependently rather than independently over time. 5 years later, at time four, Max and Julie had each completed their medical residencies and were working as medical fellows, still at the same hospital. They had gotten married a few years ago and were now raising a 6-month-old baby. Because medical fellowships are short-term positions, Max and Julie were actively looking for jobs again. But this time, Max explicitly took Julie's career into account. He said, we have to find jobs for both of us. So we're weighing what each of us wants and what sacrifice each of us is willing to make. I'm more flexible on whether it's an academic job or if it's private practice, but Julie definitely wants to do academic medicine. So it narrows it down pretty quick to a handful of places. She started reaching out to the places and talking to their program chairs. Then I went based on those locations and started applying. Whereas at time one, Max pursued career opportunities that benefited him, regardless of its impact on Julie, at time four, Max was actively considering Julie's career. What changed in these 5 years was men's growing confidence in their professional security. Max continued, the people that she works with here have been enthusiastic about hiring her to stay. Now, it looks like they might hire me at a nearby hospital. I mean, there's a demand for physicians. So there's always a chance that one of us could take a job and the other one could just wait and see. But right now, it's looking pretty good that we'll have an opportunity to stay here for both of us. Max this time more actively supported Julie's career because he was confident that there was a demand for doctors. He figured that he would take a job anywhere that Julie wanted to take a job. In addition to men's growing professional security, men's new focus on their children shaped their attitudes about their work and their family lives. Max said, I always knew I would want to make sure that my career allowed me to spend a good amount of time with family and kids. Now that I'm actually looking at jobs, I guess it's more clear what that looks like. For example, if I got the opportunity to do an academic job where I had ideal research opportunities but would be working all the time, versus a career that had less ideal academic opportunities and more time with family, I would take the second one. Max really enjoyed parenting, so he was willing to take a job that was less ideal to him professionally if it gave him more time to invest in his family. Together, we see that changes in Max's structural context, first, his increased access to jobs, and second, his new parental status, prompted these attitude changes that led him to take more interdependent rather than autonomous actions in his life with Julie. So I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to just go over some two key takeaways. First, equal partners shows that structural support for egalitarianism is necessary, but it's not sufficient to address inequalities in invisible family labor if contemporary couples are like Max and Julie, who endorse autonomy instead of active collaboration. And they don't believe that they can or should make mutual use of their professional resources to benefit one another. Second, the autonomous actor pathway in particular shows that gender unequal invisible family labor can still sometimes result in gender equal outcomes. When outcomes are equal, couples can disregard the gender imbalance processes that got them there. And this process allows gender inequality to persist in men's and women's experiences of attaining these outcomes. So perhaps like Allison, I think my book shows that it's important not to just count the outcomes or count the doing, but how do we make sense of the experiences and the processes that get couples to where they end up. Thanks again for your attention and for inviting me to be here. I'm very excited for our Q&A session once we hear from all the authors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. I remember being in undergrad and reading Unequal Childhoods by Annette Lareau and thinking, I want to be a sociologist. And I know some of our undergrads at WashU are here in the room. And Jaclyn, I can picture them having heard this talk and reading your book and thinking, I want to go study stuff like this because your findings are fascinating and so relevant. Thank you very much for this talk. Let me now present to you Dr. Bailey Brown, everybody. Dr. Brown is assistant professor of sociology in the sociology and anthropology department at Spelman College. Dr. Brown researches and teaches on the sociology of education, research methods, urban sociology, race and ethnicity, and inequality. And she's received lots of awards and lots of funding for her research and is published also in our field's top journals like the Sociology of Education. Today, she's going to be presenting her phenomenal new book, Kindergarten Panic, Parental Anxiety and School Choice Inequality, published by Princeton Press last fall. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown.
Yes, thank you so much. And it's so great to hear all about these wonderful books and to engage with you all. I'm also very excited for the Q&A. So let me go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay. All right. So again, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm also going to share major takeaways and insights from my book. And I want to start by opening up and sharing with you all what first got me interested in this research. And it was really the moments of uncertainty that permeate our lives each and every day. And I want to start by doing a small thought exercise. So I want everyone to just think back for a moment. When was the last time you had to make a decision, even though you weren't totally sure what to do? Maybe you were facing a deadline, worried about managing a heavy workload, or considering a new career option or a different path. And so we've all been there navigating big choices while feeling anything but certain. And so while the uncertainty of college admissions in the realm of education is well documented, and we can probably easily think of images of stressed parents and teenagers applying to schools and then waiting by computers to find out admissions results. But what happens when this stress starts even earlier? So, in my work, I demonstrate how deciding where to send your children to kindergarten has become one of the most high stakes moments in many American families' lives. And so, a few factors have made selecting an elementary school particularly challenging in recent years. And this has a lot to do with how enrollment in traditionally assigned public schools or your home zone neighborhood school has decreased, while we now have a bunch of non-assigned public schools. This can be the opportunity to attend a school in a different district. It can also be charter schools, magnet schools, or voucher programs. And so, due to the increase in non-assigned schools, deciding on a school has become more time-consuming and also more uncertain for parents. And so, in places like New York City, the context for my book, there are more schools for parents to pick from over the past decade, and new policies that allow parents to select not just the closest neighborhood school, but schools all over different areas. And so every year in New York City, over 60,000 kindergartners are matched to more than 700 public schools. And while in the past, most kindergartners would attend their own school, as we can see from the gray bar here, that's decreased over time. And so now parents are able to pick out of zone schools. And then in 2020, after the COVID-19 pandemic, this increased also very rapidly. But despite the increase in these school options in New York City public schools, like other urban districts, New York City remains one of the most segregated school districts in the country, still divided by race and class. And then if we look at trends beyond New York City, today, 2 out of every 5 parents have a public school option available to them. And to think about this in more recent context, data post-COVID shows how these shifts have continued. The pandemic exacerbated enrollment drops from public schools, and now more children than ever are enrolling in charter schools. And keep in mind that this graph only captures charter enrollment, but there are so many other forms of school choice, like going to another public school out of your zone or going to a magnet school, that have all increased. And so I show these graphs to demonstrate that the continued rise in non-assigned public schools has truly shaped the landscape of school choice in the United States. And so I use the phrase kindergarten panic, which actually appeared from an interview with a mother, to describe this moment of uncertainty. I argue that the recent school landscape has created a new form of labor, a labor I call school decision-making labor. And so to begin this research for this book, I interviewed a diverse range of more than 100 New York City parents across income levels and racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so all of these parents felt pressure trying to select a school for their elementary age child. And I show how some parents experience this pressure a bit more intensely and in different ways than others. And so I conceptualize parents' increased expectations to make school decisions in this new landscape of options as a new form of labor to manage. And so I use labor in this context to refer to the time, the effort, and the resources parents are investing to choose a school. And using this labor framework, I describe how decision making is a really significant area of inequality because there's broad variation, I find, in how families develop and manage their labor strategies to make decisions. And so these vast differences, in turn, really contribute to race, class, and gender-based disparities in the school search. And so each chapter in this book I've listed here builds an argument for how parents manage the uncertainties of school decision-making by taking on additional labor. And I also demonstrate how labor expectations have intensified for parents across socioeconomic background. In chapter 1, called A Mother's Duty, I focus on gendered labor and how mothers take on the labor of school decision-making. In chapter 2, What I Want for My Kids, I focus on class inequality and how social background shapes the very logics parents take on to search for schools. Chapter 3, You Don't Really Feel the Diversity, focuses on race-based labor and the extra effort families put into searching for racially inclusive schools. And then chapter 4, dealing with the world outside the door, focuses on neighborhood-based labor and the challenges parents experience when they're trying to maintain community, but their kids go to schools outside of the neighborhood. So schools are no longer social anchors. And I want to start by focusing on the chapter A Mother's Duty. And so I found that women often see their choice of a school as a reflection of whether they are good moms. Many of the mothers I interviewed said that getting their child into what they considered a good school reflected good mothering. And mothers took primary responsibility for their school search, whether they had partners or not, and regardless of their social class or racial and ethnic background. And so Vivian shares how she leaned on other mothers for help accessing information about schools. So she refers to a created moms group in the community. She says, if I didn't have the moms forum, the pre-K search would have been really tough. She goes on to describe her experience at Department of Education events. She says, the way that the Department of Education present information to you is as if you're already an insider and you already know. So moms in the community, she goes on to express her satisfaction with everything they shared, they're really all about identifying what programs are available to them and sharing them within the moms group. But if that didn't exist, then where will we get our info? So Vivian describes how she's engaging in this search, and she's the primary one responsible for this search, but also how she leans on a community of other moms who are doing that same work. And then parents' perceptions of the uncertainty of school decision-making also revealed class distinctions. So when faced with the uncertainties of school options, I found that middle-class families search for niche school options and academically rigorous schools. So Renata describes her best fit approach to finding a school for each of her children. She says, each child is different, so I've learned. I have 4 children at 4 different schools because I realized that not one school is the best fit for each child because they have different personalities. I think because with 4 kids, you look at the schools that you could possibly look at just to see which one is the best fit for your child. So Renata, a middle-class mother, channeled her uncertainty about the school decision-making process to really find a unique and specialized experience for each of her 4 children. So I found that in contrast to this, many working class parents invested in the traditional neighborhood school in hopes of maintaining consistent school experiences across generations. So Jeffrey, a working class parent, explained, my parents used to do it like this, where whatever neighborhood we were in, we went to that school. And so he says, I did the same. So despite recent increases in school choice, working class parents I interviewed emphasized maintaining consistent experiences with schools across generations. But as a result of this difference in the logic of school decision making, children from different social classes ended up attending schools that varied significantly in quality. Higher income parents like Renata searched for specialty schools with niche offerings, and lower income parents rarely selected out of neighborhood and high academically performing schools. And New York City data beyond my qualitative study points to similar results. Low-income families are less likely than people earning more than them to attend schools outside of their neighborhoods. And then I also found that parents of color feel pressure to find a racially inclusive school. And so regardless of their incomes, I found that Black, Latino, and immigrant families I interviewed felt pressure to evaluate whether the public schools they considered were racially and ethnically inclusive. And Fumi expresses this as well. She says, when talking about her son's class and the makeup of his class, she says, I don't like the fact that he's the only Black one in his class. The gifted and talented classes are mostly white, and the other classes for his grade are more diverse. She goes on to explain, because my son is in the G&T or gifted and talented class, it's different for us, but I have eyes and I see what's going on. So Fumi is very worried about the marginalization and isolation her son might experience in this class, and other parents worry that racially insensitive policies related to bullying, curriculum, and discipline would negatively affect their children. And then lastly, as parents search for schools, they also wonder about the lack of social community as their kids traverse neighborhoods, attending elementary schools all across the city. And so Kimberly reflects on the sense of neighborhood community her daughter misses now that she attends a school outside of the neighborhood. She says, I've also learned after being at the citywide school, it's really hard to have a community within the school. Kids live all over. My daughter misses her friends because she had a lot of friends, not just in her class, but from her neighborhood. They all went to the school and they were in other classes, so she saw all of her friends. She misses going to school with kids who live near her. So Kimberly is trying to reconcile this idea that her child's now at this high-performing school, but what does she do when the school is no longer a social anchor, when kids are traversing different neighborhoods and are not rooted in a neighborhood school in their community? So why is kindergarten panic important, and why is the labor of school decision making important? So the decisions that parents make have long-term social consequences. Public schools of choice, as I've shown, are expanding across New York City and in rural, urban, and suburban areas all over the United States. And the decisions parents make in elementary school can shape how students are tracked in middle school, high school, and college. And then if we think beyond education, these findings also shed light on decision making as an important area of inequality. We tend to think of wealth and income as the most intuitive measures of inequality, but through the concept of school decision-making labor, I demonstrate how inequality is also experienced in the everyday decisions people make. And so I argue that the decision-making labor framework I present is really essential for recognizing the new responsibilities parents are taking on to search for schools. It's also essential for our goals of making schools and the school search process more equitable. The parents I spoke with all live in New York City, which has a uniquely complicated education system. Yet the very pressures they face are reflective of the evolving public school choice landscape for parents all over the country. Parents nationwide are searching for schools with vastly different resources and concerns about their children's future well-being and success. So when parents panic about kindergarten, they reveal cracks in the very foundation of American schooling. Parental anxiety about kindergarten is a response to an unequal and high stakes education system. So thank you so much for listening and for joining all of us today. And please feel free to contact me with any questions. And if you'd like to learn more, you can use this QR code to purchase your copy of Kindergarten Panic. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I I was conscientious in thinking about the ordering of these presentations because Dr. Brown, I think that your book highlights so beautifully something that all three of you talked about, which is these everyday decision making processes and how they both reflect and reinforce these larger structural systems of inequality. Thank you for highlighting that, which is a Herculean task in this limited amount of time we've got. I'm thrilled to open it up for our Q&A for the remainder of our time, y'all. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat and I can read them out loud, or you can use the hand raising feature if you'd like to do that and ask the question of the panelists yourself.
While folks are thinking, I just want to commend you and Leah, Katie, for picking books that speak so nicely to each other, right? I'm like, oh, I want to, email Bailey about these ideas and Jaclyn about these ideas. So it was very cool to see that.
I have a lot of notes here for myself of things that were pinging in my brain about my own research too, because we're all thinking and talking about similar things and interested in kind of how we bring about positive social change and ameliorate these inequalities we're discussing together. So yeah, I'm right there with you, Allison. I see Layla's hand up. Layla.
Hi, everyone. My name is Layla Johnson, and I'm a junior at Spelman College and one of Dr. Brown's students. So great job, everyone. My question is for Dr. Daminger. Excuse me, how do I pronounce your last name?
That
Okay,
was perfect.
wonderful. My question is, when you were conducting your interviews, how did you identify your interview participants, and how long did the interviews take place?
Yeah, great question, Layla. Thanks so much for being here. So I had a few different methods. I'll talk about the two most common methods that I use to find participants. So the first was, Bailey mentioned this moms forum, right, that one of her participants was part of. I tapped into a lot of similar parenting forums. At the time when I was doing this research, I was based in Boston, and I looked at the Cambridge forum, the Boston forum, the Somerville forum, and would have someone post on my behalf and say, "Hey, there's a sociologist doing this study about how parents make decisions. Are you interested?" So that was method one. And then method two was I partnered with some school districts. So I got the principals of some local elementary schools to send home flyers with all of their kids. And then some of their parents contacted me about the study. So that was on the recruitment side. And then on the interview length, so interviews averaged about 60 minutes. If you've done any interview work, you know that some people are big talkers and some people are really not. So there's quite a range around that, but 60 minutes was about the average. And I did the research in three phases. So the first set of interviews was in 2017, and the last set of interviews was in 2022. And kind of each time I was sort of trying to get a different kind of information. So the first go around, I was focused on highly educated parents of young kids. The second go around, I was trying to look at, what happens when those kids get older, when they're in elementary and middle school, and what happens if we try to bring in more social class diversity. And then in the third phase, I was interested in how queer couples would approach cognitive labor. Thanks so much.
Thanks for that question, Leila. I see Nina asking a question here. Let me read this out loud for you all. Nina writes, and may I also mention just offhandedly, I attended the book launch for Nina's new book yesterday. In a second, I'll grab the link and drop it into the chat. We have a fabulous new book about parenting, the parenting economy, overinvested by Nina, that just launched as well yesterday. Nina asks, first, she says, thanks so much for these fabulous books and your excellent presentations. Might I ask you all to reflect on whether some broader societal changes have contributed to the family-related processes you examine, or how might have these processes worked at an earlier point in time, perhaps a few decades ago, and changes, and if so, why? She's juggling her own parenting, so she can't ask on camera. Nina, I feel you so much. No worries. I'll turn it over to the participants. However you want to respond is okay by me. You're welcome to all in if you'd like.
I'm happy to jump in here. I actually have a chapter in my book that discusses how COVID might have changed the decision-making patterns that I was seeing among the couples that I was studying, because I started this work in, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm so old now. I started this work in 2013, and I had just concluded the 5-year follow-ups in 2018, 2019. And so I had that moment where I was like, should I just go back into the field and interview people? It's early 2020, just as everything was shutting down and like everybody's work was going crazy and schools were shutting down. And I decided not to collect data at that time point for some reasons that I explain in the book. But I was able to kind of speculate how these kind of broader changes in the way that we work, in the way that caregiving is done in our society might have impacted the three different types of couples in my study. And I think that some of the conclusions I presented today might still hold true, where the structural context is important, but not like the sole determinant of how couples experience equality or inequality, because it's the entire package of structure, culture, and joint action. And there's like a little thread of path dependence too, that might lead couples to make certain decisions and take certain actions in response to these kind of broader changes. So that's a really great question, and I think that more longitudinal research can probably answer the question better. I was only able to do this for 6 years, but yeah, it's hard to collect data for that long over time.
Yeah, I can go next. I also think this is a great question, and probably one of the reasons why I show just how much the school choice process has changed even while I was conducting the research for this study and prior to. And so the biggest thing I can think of is since the COVID-19 pandemic, school choice has really expanded in different ways, right? So now there are even more options for virtual schooling that parents can choose, more charter schools. And so kind of having that online availability and access to information has only sort of increased what options are out there for schools. So I would say that that's the biggest aspect that's changed. And similarly, like my one thing that I'd love to do is to be able to go back and see what these parents are up to now, and to kind of like really think about how they assess how the pandemic shaped their schooling. But I think even thinking about earlier time periods, so before the introduction of the first charter school, when everyone really went to their neighborhood school, I think it draws um, an important contrast because during that time, it was very much about like where you move to, where you live, that exactly shapes the type of school you're going to get into. And now that's really shifted a lot. So when we do think about those earlier time periods, it gives a good picture of how much this labor has increased over time and why this is just a significant, really tipping point, the choices parents are making and the strategies they have to employ to make that happen.
Yeah, I'll just add another angle to all of this. So I think there's a ton of sort of structural and historical elements here that are definitely important backdrop. One that comes to mind is sort of, I didn't have a chance to talk about it today, but in the book, I talk about this shift from gender essentialism to personal essentialism, right? So gender essentialism being this idea that, men and women have these innate differences, right? And you probably picked up from my talk, or hopefully, that the personality narrative is sort of a successor to the gender essentialist narrative, right? And so I think if I were, conducting this research decades ago, probably the patterns in terms of who was doing what would be similar, right? If not even more exaggerated. But I suspect that it wouldn't require so much sort of accounting, right? Because our sort of understanding, or at least a certain segment of the population's understanding is, okay, you should be aiming for a fair and balanced partnership, right? And so the kind of sort of verbal gymnastics that some of the couples went through to justify their patterns, I suspect would have been a little bit less intense. And then another, of course, theme of all of this, and I'm so excited to read Nina's book as well, because I think this will speak to it, is just parenting has changed a lot, right? So there's the school choice element that of course Bailey is talking about. One of the things I've been thinking about is how our digital lives have really sort of created all kinds of new labor, right? By making new kinds of communication between parents and schools possible. Well, okay, if you can be in constant touch with your kid's teacher, then maybe you should be, right? And so I think there's new forms of labor, and also as inequality continues to grow, sort of pressure to perform parenthood in a good enough way to be a good mom, to get your kid ahead, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm like scribbling furiously here when I'm supposed to be moderating. Sorry, everyone. Thank you for that fabulous question and for these answers, y'all. Let me pose a question that Jennifer Glass has asked in the chat, and then we'll turn to Jennifer, the other Jennifer, Jennifer Hook. Jennifer says, for Allison, but also the others, did you present your findings to your respondents? And if so, what did they say? The perennial question
Yeah.
for qualitative researchers, huh?
Great question, Jennifer. So I have not gone back and sort of systematically, gone to all of my interviewees and said, here's my book. What do you think? But I have heard from some. Some people reached out to me sort of soon after I did the interviews, and the feedback was often along the lines of, "Wow, you prompted very good discussion," right? This for the heterosexual couples that I interviewed, I got the sense that many of them had not really confronted in a systematic way some of the dynamics we talked about in the interview. And I did not get the feedback that, and maybe these people didn't reach out, but I did not hear, you sparked a fight and now we're no longer speaking to one another, although that is possible. It was more, you're causing us to look at our relationship in different ways. And then I've heard from other folks over the years at, times when my research has gotten, popular media coverage. And most of it has been sort of along the lines of, yeah, okay, you kind of captured the dynamic. So I think that for a lot of the couples, there there wasn't like a sort of sense of there's no inequality, what are you talking about? Right? More of a kind of, oh, like I can see how there's this disconnect between what we say we are, aspiring to and what we're actually doing. And thank you for prompting us to look at it. So that's been the majority response, but who knows? Could hear about any divorces I caused any day now.
Jaclyn or Bailey, do you want to respond to that question? Have you presented the findings to your participants?
Yeah, so not in a systematic way at the later stage, but earlier stages, as this idea of like the stress and uncertainty came up across interviews, I did share that this was going to be like a big component of the book, because there was just this way that parents were kind of like unloading about like how intensive this experience was. Were they alone in this? But then some of them knew they weren't alone because of forums and groups and things. So a little bit here and there. But I think this is important in some aspects for qualitative work. And so now that the book is out there, I think it would be great to kind of share it with them and use it maybe as an opening to think about, how are things going now?
I did not share my findings with my respondents, but I experienced a lot of similar things to Bailey and Allison. And in addition, I've mostly had people, when they came across the research kind of on their own, try to identify who they were. I use pseudonyms for all of the couples, all of the people in the study. And anytime someone was like, "Oh, am I Cassandra in the study?" I would just have to say I can neither confirm nor deny, because it is to protect the confidentiality of others in the study in case they ended up knowing each other, because I was recruiting like in the Chicago area. And so there is a chance that you might have gone to the same law school as somebody else who ended up in my study. So that was kind of an interesting thing that I didn't expect, that people were just trying to figure out who they were in the study. They weren't always right.
They weren't always right. Imagine that. Thank you all for your responses to Jennifer's question. Jennifer, book, what's yours?
Hi. First, I want to thank Bailey, Jaclyn, and Allison for joining us today and for condensing your books and a decade of work into a 10-minute talk. That's a big feat. My question is for Bailey. So I know your book was really focused on these decisions and these decisions made in uncertainty. But in one of your examples, when you talked about the mom thinking about four different schools for four different children, I personally study physical labor, and I couldn't help thinking about the physical labor implications of having four different children at four different schools. And that made me think about how, I'm sure some of the parents were interviewing, they were making this decision for the first time for their first child in this context of uncertainty. And so this is really sort of about their imagined futures, right? Like what they think things are going to be like as they embark on this, just schooling pathway. And I was wondering how your participants talked about sort of the trade-offs that they were willing to make in pursuit of sending their kid to the right school, in terms of their own labor, in terms of their own lives, as well as the impacts on their children.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. These are really great questions. And so, yes, the mother who is sending her children to four different schools in different directions. Like one thing I talk about is how like the labor of transportation. So like the New York City subway system, it makes it seem like, oh, you could get anywhere, you could make it to this school, but it does take a lot of time. And so that time labor is factored in. And then I think it also shapes like the choice sets and the people's work schedules and the ability to go to this school, even if it is technically available, right? And so that's why I make that point of thinking about class inequality and school decisions. Because yes, if you're working class, there's technically a school available in a distant neighborhood, but are you familiar with that neighborhood? Would you feel safe going to that neighborhood? Can you get to that neighborhood with your work schedule? So, there's a certain level of privilege to being able to navigate the city with ease to get to these different school locations. So that is part of that transportation, that physical labor. And then one thing that I think I found really interesting about the interviews with parents is how much parents integrated their own school stories into the decisions they were making for their children. And this shows up a little bit in the What I Want for My Kids chapter that does focus on class inequality, but it's also how parents are reimagining and rethinking the education they want for their kids based on what they had. So, like parents who might have had a rigid or highly structured type of education are reimagining something different because they see this as a possibility with school choice. So that's part of kind of like how they're thinking about schools. And then in terms of trade-offs, I think that came up a lot with like thinking about the school as a social anchor versus like this other opportunity elsewhere, and distance too. So like I think a big trade-off was, do I want my child, like thinking about the quality of the education and then the distance of that school. So for instance, there are many gifted and talented citywide schools that are harder to get into, harder to get to from many neighborhoods, but then you stay in that school for longer. And then there are many trade-offs that parents of color are making. So the biggest one is thinking about the academic quality of the school, but the racial demographics of the school, and feeling like that's a constant trade-off that parents have to extend extra labor for kind of just thinking about like monitoring the experience, like thinking about the work that Allison's doing, but like monitoring the racial climate repeatedly because they're worried about the isolation or marginalization their child's experiencing. So a lot of different trade-offs for many different parents. So thank you for those great questions.
Thanks, Bailey, and thank you, Jennifer. I see a question in the chat from, I think, one of Dr. Brown's students. Is it Katya? I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. This is a question for Allison. In your interviews with families, did you see a difference in responses on how gendered or cognitive labor was understood depending on the cultural and or racial backgrounds of the family?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So yes, I did see some small differences, but I always caveat this with the reminder that my sample is primarily white, and so I'm talking about small numbers. And so I sort of mention a couple things, but I try really hard not to say, and this is how the differences, would be if we looked at a broader sample. My hope is that others will kind of pick up on these threads and then investigate them in additional research. A couple things that I noticed. So, number one, I mentioned briefly that there were some, a small number, right? 1 in 5 of the different gender couples were balanced or male-led couples, right? Where he was doing more of the cognitive labor or they were roughly splitting it. And within that group, there were like a lot of not a lot numerically, but in terms of, my sample, there were several folks who men who were born in Europe, right? And so that to me was really interesting. I think that speaks a little bit to Katie's work, that something about the sort of work, family, gender culture in your country of origin might be influencing the way that you approach cognitive labor in your household. So that's one, hint. I'm hopeful that there will be more cross-national research. I've gotten some interesting questions in talks I've given recently about, can you compare to the Nordic countries and see, how does policy affect this? But I think part of it is also culture. Um, Another thread that I saw, I had a small group of my respondents who were Latinx, right? Who were several of whom, had immigrated from Latin America. And that group, I saw more gender essentialist statements, right? So I talked in my presentation about, this emphasis on personality. When I spoke with some of the Latinx respondents, there was a bit more of a, well, that's a man's job, that's a woman's job, right? So that's another thread that I'm, hopeful that others will follow up on.
Thank you, Allison. We've got a question in the chat from Dr. Melissa Milkey. Wonderful research contributions. And for all presenters, she asks, since COVID, much research with representative samples show that married fathers are doing proportionately more unpaid work. Some of this may be due to remote work where there's more exposure to more needs by men, etc. If fathers were around the home more, structural changes to work, for being available more for school decisions and issues, planning, following a plumber coming by, etc. Perhaps they'd even perceive their personality as a planner if they're more home-based, etc. Thoughts, Jill?
I'd love to respond to this because I've been thinking a lot about how for the consistent compromisers in my study, the availability of remote work and flex place and those other flexible working policies were really key to how men and women were able to kind of shore up those resources and help one another maintain careers and be equal participants at home. And now it's just much, much more available to couples all over the place. But, in line with the thing I keep emphasizing, where structure is not enough, I think that we see some work, from people like Alia Rao, that some people don't view that as a resource that they should take up. So even if remote work is available to men, they might say, but I'm better off going to the office. Like there is a policy of like it's okay to work from home, but like I really should be putting in FaceTime. And there's kind of like this backlash pressure of bringing people back into office. And I think there's probably current research going on this, but my gut feeling is that men are heeding that call and women are exiting and saying, no, if you're calling me back to work, I'm going to find another job that's going to enable me to, balance all this work and family stuff. So I think that some of these structural changes might not be quite enough to make these changes to men viewing their personalities as planners, not without a little more on the cultural change front, and also how partners might be interacting with each other, right? If men's default reaction to a return to office mandate is, I guess I'm going in, and women's reaction to a return to office mandate is, I guess I'm finding a different job, right? That confluence of different independent choices might lead us to see some gender inequality. But I'll turn to Allison since I think this question is related to her work too.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, so much. I was super optimistic. Well, on this dimension, I was super optimistic going into the pandemic, right? That like, okay, everyone's going to be at home and they're going to see this invisible work is going to become less invisible. And it's not in this book, but in some other research I've done with interviews collected during the pandemic in 2020 to 2021, there was some evidence that some men were kind of we talk about growing in attunement, right? They were around their partner and their children all the time, right? And they still often framed it as meeting their partner's needs rather than doing things for the household. But I did see a subset of men who were like, I see that my wife gets really stressed when the house looks like this, or she's overwhelmed, right? So I am kind of trying to be more aware of that and meet her expectations. The sort of negative side is that this particular study that I'm talking about was longitudinal. We interviewed couples over about 2 years, and when he was back in the office, right, those gains often seem to erode pretty quickly. So it didn't, I don't want to say there are no examples of this, but the sort of primary pattern that we saw in this data, my colleagues and I, was more that like, okay, that was a particular moment, right? And we're all together and we're in it. Once he's back in the office, it was very easy to sort of revert. So not super, optimistic, but that's just what I've seen in the qualitative data.
Melissa, did you want to respond? I bet you have
Yeah.
thoughts.
Well, I'd love to hear what Professor Brown thinks as well, and especially in terms of schooling and intensive parenting, which, like from the latest research, it suggests that men and women are buying equally into this, model of child rearing, and so, you know, in some of the time diary research, which I know is not capturing the invisible work and so on, but post-pandemic, men's changes have stuck. Women kind of went back to doing less around the home because everybody did more during the pandemic, right? Because there was more to do around the home and housework and childcare and so on. But yeah, so I think the perceptions are so fascinating, the processes of people's negotiations and how they're understanding their role as a parent, as a mother, and so on. But sometimes it seems to be potentially in conflict with what we see in the, you know, representative samples. So yeah, anyway, I'm curious to hear what Professor Brown says about if fathers were around more, for example, in the case of schooling. But it's just a great potential contradiction that I think will be something to look into in the future.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely worth looking into. And, I'm thinking about it in my head. I wonder if it's like something particular about as much as I would, so I'll say this, as much as I would want it to have changed post-COVID and for those changes to have stuck, I don't know if I'm completely thinking that it would. And I think it's because of how school choice, different from like household work, is sort of this like work that's like external, a little bit external to the home, and then could be reinforced by gender norms that maybe even like the school sets, like as an example, like, they're like who gets called first, like when a child's sick or when something happens at the school, right? Maybe the dad would be the one to respond, but who is the school calling? Just like different things like that. But actually, what your question made me think of is how it's also this is very different, but it's changed parents' perceptions of like what schooling can look like. So there were moments during the COVID-19 pandemic where parents were watching what their kids were learning, like almost looking in over at the Zoom screen. And so I think the maybe a different change that we see, less on the gendered side of things, is just thinking differently about the educational possibilities for their kids, considering virtual options like other school opportunities. So I do think that that aspect of school choice is shifting, although I can't be sure about like that gender dynamic there. But I do think there is something that changed, like just thinking about like the digital resources available to us and like what the expectations for what our kids can do, like online and in that format.
Yeah, I'll just add, Melissa, you bring up such an important point and one that I've given a lot of thought to. And we should talk more about this, but I don't feel like folks have yet cracked the measuring of, school choice type labor or cognitive type labor in quantitative ways. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is sort of just because folks have gotten more equal on the physical labor front, which I think you're right, that some of the post-COVID, time data shows, that doesn't necessarily follow that they would also be sharing the cognitive work more equally, right? It's possible they are, but just the way that I kind of saw how these move together or not, as the case might be in my couples. I don't think that we can sort of extrapolate from movement toward equality on the physical front to say necessarily also they are sharing more of this mental responsibility. I hope they are, right? But that's the piece that I'm a bit more skeptical about.
Melissa, do you want to respond? You just mentioned in the chat that
Yeah.
dad's child management's gone up hugely since COVID from the American Time Use Survey data, which is, you know what? Let's take those glimmers of hope where we can find them.
Yeah, I just think it's really exciting.
Yeah.
We can't really measure it very well, of course, with time. I totally agree. But there's little pockets where you can measure it, and we do see change there. And in dad's doing more traditionally female stuff. So it's just very cool to try to put, I think, the qual work together with the
Totally.
quantitative work, and I just find all of your work so amazing. So thank you.
Ditto. I can ask a question if I don't see any other hands raised. Is that all right? Okay, cool. So I am interested, as Allison mentioned, this in this kind of cross-national comparison brings me to this question about a thread that I have read in all of your work and heard today, which is about this kind of persistent American obsession with the individual, right? We heard in Allison's talk today about this personal essentialism, right? It's just my personality. It's just me, right? This is just that I'm type A, right? I'm anal. I'm neurotic, right? For women. Jaclyn said that this was an independent decision for the woman choosing to go to this rural hospital, which is probably not the best for her career, if I had to guess. And then Bailey also said, each of my children is different, so they each need a different solution for their schooling, right? And so, time and again, I keep hearing this individualist explanation and the persistent inability on Americans' parts, American parents' parts in particular, to like identify the structural sources shaping their everyday decision making, and for thinking about the kind of perils and possibilities for equality when it comes to work and family. I'm wondering if there were any, like, how do we get people to start paying attention to structure in their daily lives here when we are so obsessed with the individual in US society? We rely on ourselves, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we were only responsible for ourselves and our families, right? These are not the same sorts of discourses I heard in other places, but I wonder if there are any deviant cases. Were there any folks in your studies, Allison, you mentioned some of these men who came from Europe. Like, are there deviant cases that suggest that there are ways in which we might try to encourage folks to identify the structures in their lives? Do they all need to take Social 101 in high school? Is that the solution? Like, what do we do to get people to start noticing the impact of structure and to look outside themselves as individuals, to think more broadly and maybe more collectively about their own families, but also what we owe one another?
This is a really hard question, Katie, but
I
it's a good
know it's
one.
not fair.
I think it's important. So, I have a bunch of different thoughts on this one. One of the things that I struggle with as a sociologist who in some ways, lives out my research, right? I've got a young child, I'm partnered with a man, is sometimes structure feels really disempowering. Like if I get too mired in okay, and our childcare system is terrible, and our employment system is terrible, and we have no, like that just feels it's easy to get stuck in that sort of hopelessness and powerlessness. And so I think more so now that I have a kid, sort of get this like I want to reach for the things that it feels like I can control, which is, my individual attitudes, my individual relationships. The one thing that I do see as effective in my particular case of household labor is I think when couples can acknowledge structure as a kind of common enemy, right, and recognize that it is impacting both partners, above and beyond their intentions for the relationship, right? I think sometimes that can open up new possibilities, right? To say that, okay, it is not, you're not doing anything and I'm doing everything, so much as what are the structural forces that have nudged us into this place? Like, how do we work together? And that seems to open up some more possibilities in the particular case that I study. But maybe Jaclyn or Bailey have better ideas.
No, I was gonna say, so it's making me think of so many things, and I agree, it's like a hard question to think about. But I will say that I did interview families who were thinking like about the structure and like not just about the individual. So like remember Fumi was like, I have eyes, like I see what's going on. Like that to me is like a lead, a pathway to I see the bigger picture of like why all kids are ending up in schools in this particular way. And then in the chapter that's on diversity, I have Some white families who I interviewed, they talked about like, I intentionally wasn't going to invest in the gifted and talented program because I saw what it did to the classrooms, right? So I think there are ways that, families are thinking critically about these decisions and kind of seeing what's going on. And I think another way that I think it appears to people thinking about the structure is like that last chapter that, surprised me as I was like writing about it and thinking about it as a finding was like noticing like this lack of community. So thinking about the bigger picture of what happens when so many of us make these school decisions to leave the neighborhood. Where does that leave the neighborhood that we're from? So thinking about it in this way, like I shared Kimberly's quote, but before she was talking about her daughter missing her neighborhood school, she was mentioning like, I moved to this neighborhood to have this sense of community. So what does it mean when not just me, but other parents make similar decisions to exit? So I think there are these small ways where people are considering the structure in a bigger way. So yeah, so I think I'd like to consider how we make that, like how we make those moments like larger and bigger or make those moments brighter in a way to kind of think about that as an opportunity. So, yeah.
I think I want to add one more comment here, is that I don't necessarily think that people are completely oblivious to the structure. Like I think the way that my couples understood things was maybe not in the terms that sociologists would use, but they would recognize the context that they were living in. And I think, the idea of looking at deviant cases was really helpful. And I highlight deviant cases across the chapters in my book, because in particular for one of the tending traditional couples, the deviant case there was a couple that was just consistently following the man across his career trajectory up until the point that the woman was like, I'm just like not even happy. Like I never get to do the things that I'm passionate about. Like I'm considering whether to end this relationship. And that kind of shock to that, nuclear family that feels very individual, was big enough for the man to say, this career is going to end my life with you, and that is not what I want. And so he completely changes his career path to take him out of a context that was kind of, like sucking him in all the time and like, getting him engaged in kind of these like toxic masculinity type things that are present in a lot of, male dominated workplaces. Um, and so I think that the way people experience things feels very individual, but it's not like they don't realize that there are external forces that are potentially pointing them in one direction over another. So, how do we get more collective action from that? I'm not sure, but I think that people realize that they're in a context. They're just not using the language of like structure and like culture in the same way that we are.
Thank you for these responses, y'all. I think to relate to Dr. Milky's question, the pandemic was also this opportunity to identify structure, to be like, this awful external shock is impacting all of us so hugely that it kind of created some, I've written before about like some fissures in our cultural imagination about what we want for ourselves and our families and our work lives that can be quite powerful opportunities for change. And it kind of like remains to be seen how durable these fissures in our imagination are that might open up new possibilities. So thank you. Thank you all for these very thoughtful questions today. Thank you to our three fantastic panelists for their talks, for their insights about their books. Please, y'all in the audience, go buy these books, request them at your university libraries, teach them in your classes. I hope to see all of you at the WFRN conference in Montreal in June. Thank you very much for being here today. I'll stick around for a minute or two if anyone has any lingering questions, but we're at time. So I will bid you good day. Please stay warm in this cold front that's sweeping the country. I wish you all well and really look forward to seeing you hopefully in just a few months in person.